Welcome to the Classroom Podcast, the book club discussion on the classic political philosophy. My name is Erick Nganyange. I'm your host and the student in this class, sitting here with the one and only Professor Ron Klein. Professor,
how are you?
I'm doing very well. Protagoras.
Yes.
Before we get to him, I wanna go back last time when we discussed the apology. So I wanna go back to that real quick, and then we're gonna start talking about Protagoras.
Take your time.
So after Socrates was charged and was accused, charged, convicted, and executed.
Correct.
How long after he was dead did the Athenian realize, we made a mistake?
Yeah, I can't give you a precise number because we don't know a precise number, but it wasn't very long after. Then they had second thoughts and did things like they built a nice statue of him and put it, let's see, where did they put it? Maybe by the office of the Archon Basileus, is the guy that had to write out the indictment for him based on the charge of Miletus, and he's supposed to be, that Archon, supposed to be the sort of figure of justice in Athens.
Okay. Was there any retaliation to those three accusers of Socrates after that? And because people can quickly turn around and say, you know what, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, there's some indication that Miletus himself was brought up on charges and executed, and that the other two guys that sort of signed on to the charge sheet that Miletus filled out, that would be Lycon and Anytus, were essentially run out of town. Okay, charges started being brought, but if you get a couple weeks of time after they hand you an indictment before you have to go see the Archon Basileus again.
They skip the town.
And you skip town, yeah.
Huh.
So, but, to say that absolutely positively, nobody can, but there's indications that happened. But that's the kind of thing that could happen, it's a problem with all democracies. Everybody's all emotional and they want something and they do it, and then they realize, oops, we didn't really think that through very carefully.
We shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Anyway, those are some of the questions I had on the apology. Protagoras.
Yes.
That was the name of the person.
Protagoras is the name of a person.
Okay, which Socrates was having dialogue with.
Yes, maybe I should give a little introduction to him.
Yeah,
that's useful.
That's what I was about to ask you.
Yeah,
who was this guy?
Well, Protagoras was in his late Middle Ages. He grew up in a different city. He became what got to be called Sophists.
So he was not Athenian?
Not Athenian. I think he was from Abdera, but don't push me on that, okay? At any rate, what's a sophist? A sophist, that comes from a Greek word sophos, which means wise. That's not a modest thing to call yourself.
Yeah,
right?
I was about to say that's already going to raise some question with Socrates.
Oh, you betcha. And it goes a lot deeper even than that. And same with Plato. They both didn't like what the sophists were doing. And so let me explain that a little bit. What the sophists were doing really was teaching rhetoric. And they did that by going around from city to city, encouraging young men. But at any rate, why would these young men want to go to a sophist and learn rhetoric? The way the sophists taught it was, we can teach you to persuade people of anything you need to persuade them of, so that you can have the city do what you want them to do, and therefore you will be successful and probably wealthy and wealthier.
Is that the definition of rhetoric? It's the art of argument?
Well, alas, I wish it was that. Rhetoric by definition is the art of persuasion.
Okay.
Now, it's an instrument. I mean, there's knowledge and skills. It would be not an issue for Socrates or Plato if they taught what was just and right and good, the thing is, the sophists say, we can teach you to be persuasive about anything, either side of the discussion. And so whether it's right or wrong doesn't matter. It's just so we can persuade you.
This was good skill for politicians to learn.
Absolutely. And that's how these young men get to be powerful, if they can persuade people either in an assembly like Athens, but also in a court. So Protagoras has come to Athens. He stays at a private citizen's house. The man's name was Callias, right? And he'd stay there for a while and give set speeches to the sort of advertisement for how good he was, trying to entice people like Alcibiades and Critias and other young men, most of whom are named there, to sign up with him for his class in rhetoric. So they're there, and Socrates is coming to Callias' house with a young friend of his named Hippocrates, not the guy who was the physician. But it's interesting because the young man wants Socrates to introduce him to Protagoras so that he can sign up with him. But he doesn't know how to do that. Therefore, will be a good person to introduce me and speak on my behalf. And he does that. And he says, my young friend Hippocrates would like to sign up. And I was just wondering what he would learn if he studied with you. And that sort of triggers a discussion about, does Protagoras teach the virtues, or does he just teach how to be persuasive regardless? Okay. Yeah. So that triggers it. Protagoras does claim that virtue can be taught. He's kind of slippery about, does he teach it?
Before we get to that, Sophists, do I say that right? Sophist? Sophist. That was before, it was pre-Socratic. Was that what they say?
Well, they were actually contemporaries with Socrates.
Okay.
They kind of arose about the same time Socrates gets involved in his mission from God.
He was best known for his thesis, man is the measure of all things.
Oh, yes.
What does that mean?
Well, the innocuous meaning of that would be something like, everything should be built, made, written, particularly for human beings. And the Greeks at that time took that to heart for architecture. So they don't build monumentally large buildings for the most part. It's kind of surprising when you get to Athens and you see the Parthenon for the first time. This is one of the most famous buildings, and you're expecting it to be like 10 stories high, and it's not. It's like 3 stories high, and it's 100 feet long and 60 feet wide. But that was their style. We'll just build them so they're fit for human beings. Now, even then, their temples were much larger than their civic buildings or residential ones because a god lives there, right? So you go a little extra effort. But that's the innocuous meaning. Here's the one that becomes troublesome, and it fits our age very nicely. If man is the measure of all things, and you mean by that each individual human gets to decide right and wrong, then what you're espousing is a form of radical moral relativism. What basically it says is everybody can believe what's right and wrong. They will decide. You have your set of moral values, and I have my set of moral values, and we're each of us the authority on those, and they can't be questioned because, after all, you have yours, and you've thought about them however you think about them, and I've thought about mine, and so conversation is not really possible, and that, number one, is very isolating, and number two, what that does is cause fractures in the social fabric. Man is a measure of all things is a form of social acid, because if we can't talk about what's right and wrong, it's really hard for us to sensibly live together.
What was the age difference between Protagoras and Socrates?
Well, good question. Probably around 35 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Protagoras was that old?
Yeah, he was getting right up there, and he was old enough so that when he went into a town to recruit students, he actually right off said, yes, I'm a sophist. That's why I'm here. Prior to that, sophists usually came to town sort of in disguise. So for some people, it's a questionable trade to be in.
Was it one of those fields was looked down upon at that time? And was it because of they were getting paid?
Well, a couple of things. It was a kind of edgy job, let's say. People got on to the idea that you're just teaching people to be persuasive no matter what their views are. So anybody in a radical democracy like Athens says, if you're just trying to promote your own beliefs for your own good, you're not acting on behalf of the city and us citizens.
So this conversation happened in the house of Callias. So far, I did not see Callias say anything in that dialogue yet.
Yeah, I think he only comes in and greets.
And that's it.
And then he says,
sit on the recliner and just listen.
Yeah, have a good time.
Yeah.
Talk to them. Oh, I guess he helps. He gets the group organized because they're sort of spread out throughout the house. So he says, okay, you guys move your chairs in here, and you guys move your chairs in here, and they get all comfortable, and then the talk starts. Yeah.
The meat to the dialogue, Protagoras is teaching, he's claiming that he's teaching people virtue.
He does make that claim, and he's particularly interested in talking about political virtues, and we know what those are.
Yeah.
So we have wisdom and justice and sophrosine, which, again, is such a hard word to define, but let's just call it moderation. And then there's piety and courage. We left out courage.
Courage,
That's the last one. Okay, so now it's interesting because after he and Socrates talk a little bit, Protagoras says to Socrates, well, I can explain to you the answer to your questions.
Yeah.
And I can do it in two ways. I can do it by offering a logos, that is a reasoned account where we'll have a conversation about it, and I'll reveal the premises of my belief and the conclusions, and we can talk about those. Or I can tell you a story, mythos in Greek.
So Socrates' main question was, can virtue be taught?
That's the way it starts.
Before we get any further, Professor, let's explain what is virtue.
It's the fundamental unit of morality. When we talk about somebody being a good person, we talk about you being a good person.
You're the only one to say that, just for the record.
Well, I'm trying to keep you in good standing with Jackie. So it's things that we would talk about in terms of virtue. You're honest. You help little old ladies across the street. You are kind to people. But it's those kind of things.
Yeah.
And the ancient Greeks had that set of 5 that we just mentioned, which were a different set than we normally think about, although I think we would be better off if we thought more about the ancient Greek ones, in addition to ours. Nothing wrong with the ones we talk about. So Protagoras thinks you can teach the Greek virtues. Yeah. And Socrates says, well, I never thought you could do that. So that's when Protagoras offers to explain it. And in that explanation, he identifies those 5 virtues as the virtues necessary for the formation of a society and its continuance. And here's where we are reflecting back on last season, because you recall we spent 3 episodes talking about the social contract theorists. Yeah. We'll see Protagoras himself say that, look, it's the character of the people that matters. If they don't have these virtues, we got no society and therefore no government. That's something that Plato will espouse in the Republic, where Plato will want to talk, why does the type of government that cities have change from time to time? And he points out that it's a function of the character of the population. that each form of government creates a character in the population that ultimately leads to its overthrow. So it's a big deal, right? Aristotle will go along with that as well. So the ancient world...
Virtue was a big deal.
Was a big deal. It was essential to even have a society and then a government, okay?
Which is true.
Well, I tend towards that belief, right?
If you have more than half of the population is not honest, you get in trouble.
Yeah, or just, or you name it, right?
Yeah.
You might get away without escorting little old ladies across the street, but you can't get along without honesty.
I think you mentioned something on those lines in the past. Most people in our society, they follow laws or they obey the laws just because it's a good thing to do. Because like in Messon City, we only have about, 48 cops with a population of about 25,000. If everybody said they're not going to obey the laws, those 48 cops cannot enforce everything.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, so that's part of the virtue, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we, in this country and in most countries, one sort of relies on the fact that if the people know what the laws are, they will, partly out of self-interest, but partly for the good of all of us, will obey them.
So let's say we look at the city, maybe the city or the state or the country per se, just falling apart. Nothing working in that country. Should we turn around and see if the people are virtuous?
Well,
Could that be the reason?
Yeah, you're describing a society where the social fabric is being stressed, right?
Yes.
Now, there are lots of ways that can happen. It could be the character of the people that we've just talked about. But, the government plays an important role. If you could say the Soviet Union, the people were stressed all the time to the max. It wasn't so much the people's character, it was the character of the regime. Remember, the government has the sole use of force. They can kill you.
But would you argue that the regime is coming from our society? Because these are not the people that are coming outside the country. We raised them.
Yes.
Can we say that's... Because even in our society right now, we are not going to say everybody's virtuous.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
We'll say, but most people are.
Yes, at least to an extent enough so that we can live together.
So would you say we need to be careful about, let's say the ratio is 60-40. Should we say, okay, 60% is virtuous and 40% is not? Should we say we need to be careful with those 40% that cannot get to the power of the government because they can ruin everything else? And
correct.
Everybody
That's
else.
Exactly right. But there's a thing called ordinary virtue. Our society's run on ordinary virtue. You can usually trust any business person you deal with.
Yeah.
Don't know them. We can say, well, if I go into the drugstore there to buy some Band-Aids or something, I can be almost 100% certain that I will be charged the amount that's written on the facing of wherever it is. When I get up to the cashier, they will charge me that amount. If I pay cash, they will give me the correct change, and so the transaction goes smoothly. That's ordinary virtue. And that's what makes our culture work. And we don't prize that highly enough. We look for people who might be saintly, and that's great. And I think we ought to encourage that. So Protagoras is going to tell this interesting story about why those 5 virtues are the political virtues. His story involves the creation of human beings right at the beginning. And he says, the gods got together and underground, and they created all of animal life. But there were no characteristics. They were like mushrooms at that point. So the father of those gods, Zeus, said to 2 of the lesser gods, they were brothers, Prometheus and Epimetheus. He said, we're getting ready to bring up all these new creatures to the surface of the earth and let them live there, but they don't have any characteristics. They're like mushrooms. So will you guys hand out characteristics like claws and teeth and thick skin and stuff so that all of them will survive? Because I don't want them being destroyed. And he particularly doesn't want human beings to be destroyed because they're literally molded in the image of gods. Gods had a human form and lived on the earth, in a very high part of it, at Mount Olympus for sure. But the Greeks always envisioned them as having human-like forms, only perfect ones. So the two brothers get together, and Epimetheus says, look, brother, I've got this. I'll go ahead and pass out the characteristic. When I'm done, I'll call you, and you come back and sort of judge my work. So he gets busy, and animals start coming up, and he gives some, blazing speed. Others of them have really tough skin, like a water buffalo that even a lion can't penetrate with its claws. And so he's really happy, and he's just passing out characteristics. And he thinks he's all done, but then this first human shows up. First mushroom human. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't have any more things to give out. This is Zeus's favorite thing, and I'm out of characteristics. So he calls his brother over right away. So Prometheus, I kind of messed up. So Prometheus says, we got to fix this right now because Zeus is going to be really mad at us. So Prometheus runs up to the workshop of the goddess Athena. She's the goddess of wisdom generally, but particularly the wisdom of human crafts, okay? And particularly household crafts like weaving and spinning and that sort of thing, but also carpentry and making sandals and so on. So he manages to steal the secrets of all of those and pass them out to this proto-human. And then he says, oh, but they're defenseless. So he sneaks into the workshop and he steals fire. The fire is really useful. The only problem left is they can't work together. They don't have the art of working together. They can individually or in small groups do things, but that doesn't keep them alive much because they keep getting attacked by wild animals who are, have all these magnificent characteristics. What is a man against a lion? So Zeus is getting really upset. He says, well, they need to be able to work together.
Now, Zeus is the god of Athenian, right?
He's the god of
Athenians?
all Greeks.
Oh, Greeks, okay.
Yeah, one thing the Greeks have in common is what is called the pantheon, which just means all the gods, but it's not all, it's just the top 12.
Okay.
All right, so think of him as father god, okay? So Zeus says, okay, if they could just work together and live in cities and combine their efforts to fend off the attacks of animals, they'll be able to survive all right. So there's a messenger god, and Zeus turns to him. Hermes, we would think of as Mercury, his Roman name. Go down and give to humans these 5 virtues. Because if they have that, they'll have the political art and they can live together in society without killing each other off or breaking apart so that they have to go out and face the wild animals. So, okay, but Hermes says, well, when I've given out other things, I've only given them to 1 or 2 or 3 people. This is a whole new ball game. So do I do it the same way, or do I give it to all humans? Well, Zeus says, look, everybody's got to have them because they're all in the same society, we hope. And you don't have to give the same level of the virtues, right? As long as everybody, or at least the strong majority, have them, they'll be able to get along. And, oh, by the way, Hermes, tell them that if there's anybody in their society that doesn't seem to have the virtue of justice, you have to tell them to exile or kill them, because they will be a poison on the society. So that virtually is saying justice is the most important virtue, because if everybody doesn't have that, things will fall apart. So now we've got the virtues. It's interesting, though, that, and I said there are 5 virtues, and there are, Zeus only gives them 4. One of them's not on the list.
Oh, really?
Yes.
What are the four?
Sophrosyne,
Okay.
justice, wisdom, and piety.
Oh, I was thinking maybe piety will be left out. So there's no courage in there.
No courage. So it's interesting because there's talk back and forth then between Protagoras and Socrates, and then Socrates comes to it, well, let me summarize. And here are the virtues you laid out as being the civic or political virtues, and he puts courage in there. So that's actually added by Socrates. But, Protagoras doesn't object in the least, okay?
So Protagoras' idea that virtue of being given to everybody by God.
Right.
I can see Socrates' argument is that then why do you need to teach them?
His argument is you can't teach them. He says, I just don't think you can do that. Now, Protagoras makes, in his story, talks about, for example, parents raising children. Mm-hmm. You remember your childhood, and I remember mine. You're given directions by your parents. As Protagoras points out, parents are educating their kids all the time.
Was that one of the Socrates' question in there that if a virtue can be taught, then why do good parents often have bad kids? And vice versa?
Yeah, I said, so Protagoras, if you're right, and parents are always talking about teaching the virtues, why do the children of some virtuous people not turn out so good, right? And he's thinking of people perhaps like Alcibiades, who, after all, was raised in the household of Pericles.
Oh, wow.
One of the most esteemed Athenians of that era, by far. Yeah. So it's a good point. And so that leads them into a long discussion about the teaching of virtue.
What do you think? Can virtue be taught?
Well, the more I read Plato, the more I'm inclined to agree with Socrates, who upholds the idea that you can't teach virtue for the most part, because I just don't think we've come to a good enough understanding of what those virtues really mean. Generally speaking, all of the dialogues are about trying to figure out and understand what the virtues are. How can you talk about whether they're good ones to have or not if you literally don't understand thoroughly what they are?
So are we born with the virtues already?
Well, that raises a bunch of interesting questions, and they're summed up in the phrase natural law. Natural law, in some way, embodies the idea that people, if not right at birth, very early on, have some sense of virtue, of the way you ought to behave. All little babies are born with certain inclinations. You know right away when they're hungry. So we have those kind of things. So those are there, but we don't usually call them virtues. But there does seem to be some sense of, for example, fair play. Now, I'm fortunate I have triplet grandchildren, and I've enjoyed watching them. For the most part, they sensed what they could do and what they couldn't do in the sense of right and wrong. But there seems to be some let's call them proto-virtues. Not well developed, but there. And certainly then the education that Protagoras talks about kicks in. Your dad can teach you how to behave, right? We've both been through that. They have very non-subtle ways sometimes of doing that.
Yeah, they have a way of teaching you.
Yeah.
That you don't forget.
You never forget those.
Yeah.
Mom generally is a lot more nice and nurturing, but she can get her message across really well too.
Yeah, one of those wait until your dad gets home.
Well, that one works really well. So the education kicks in, and most of the people in a community internalize those, and so can display them when the situation is appropriate.
Yeah, let's go back to, and I don't want to go too deep into. Let's go to Aristotle for a little bit in terms of his book of ethics, because he said the best way to have a virtue is to practice them.
Yeah, he literally says virtue is a habit.
How do you practice habit that cannot be taught?
It would be hard. But, of course, Aristotle thought it could be taught. But he's got two levels, and so does Plato. So Aristotle says, none of this stuff I'm talking about is going to make any sense unless you already have the habit of virtue. And so why does he have to talk to people about it if they already have the habit? So they understand more deeply why, and that gives you a bigger range of application. So now you can go into a situation that you're unfamiliar with and still kind of dope out what the right thing to do is. Plato, the same way, I think. And, Socrates says, well, sure, I can teach virtue. And he tries to give a demonstration of that. And Plato's asking us to judge whether that worked or not. But he can maintain the fact that, yes, we all grow up with our parents teaching us some virtues. But that doesn't mean we understand them very well.
Yeah.
And that until we understand them, we won't understand ourselves either. And understanding ourselves is the ultimate in understanding.
Yeah. Let's say a child is born. And right after the child is born, ended up being put in the wilderness with the wild animal. That kid, let's say it's he survived and he lives in the wilderness until age of 18 and 19. Then he get rescued from the wilderness, get it put in a society. Now, through all that time he was living in the wilderness, he had no contact with the human being. Are you telling me if that human beings get put back in the society, they're doomed?
Yes.
And they cannot be taught virtue after that. Is that
No.
the deal?
No, but that's an impossible experiment to do. Mm-hmm. There are some stories about it in the ancient world, talking about the foundation of Rome, that occurs when their mother, who's illegitimately pregnant, takes two boys, Romulus and Remus, and puts them in a wicker basket and lets them float down the Tiber River. Sound vaguely familiar?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're infants. They're literally newborns, right? And they come down. And one of the stories
was that Moses in the Bible?
Moses in the Bible, and of course you remember Sargon the Great, who has exactly the same story as Moses. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a whole different conversation, but it would be fun.
Yeah.
So in the Roman case, there's two versions, but one of them is a mother wolf pulls the basket over to shore, and the kids get out somehow, newborns, neat trick. Maybe she drags them out. I don't know. But then she gets them over to their cave in the side of the Capitoline Hill, one of the famous 7 hills of Rome, and raises them. And they grow up with all the normal attributes of a human being. So, but that's a founding myth. We have to keep that in mind. But if you talk to psychologists, in the absence of other humans, the baby would die. Because it's certainly part of us that
need the human contact.
We need human contact. And likewise, what's the most severe penalty in jail? To be put in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Because humans are very social.
So how do we acquire virtue then, according to Socrates, if it cannot be taught?
Well, there's two ways. We are taught by parents to some extent, right? Parents don't typically say, you need to be this way, and then go into elaborate metaphysical explanation, right? It's more like, do that or else, right? So we get the behavior without much rationale. Socrates says you're not really virtuous until you understand the rationale, because we're that kind of creature. Understanding is critical to us.
Okay.
Right?
Until you understand why you want to be virtuous.
Yeah, and exactly what you mean by that virtue.
Yeah. Sometimes Socrates just asks these questions. I'm like, that was unnecessary.
Like what?
There was no need to bring that up. So I think they were talking about moderation.
Yeah.
Him and I say, Do you think that an unjust man can be moderate in his injustice?
That's a clever question, right? Socrates is a brilliant man. We both agree with that.
I start thinking, like, yeah, because there's a difference between a person who killed one person and the person who killed 100. Would you call that moderation?
No, I wouldn't. However, the penalty is the same.
Yeah. So I was like, maybe there's some moderation in justice.
Yeah, and he asked.
Anyway, I thought that was a brilliant question, and I was like, here we go in the rabbit hole.
Yeah, but remember, clearly one of the points of the dialogues, all of them, is to teach us. And one of the best ways to teach us is to get us off center a little bit. So we stop and we say, wait, that doesn't seem right. Well, why doesn't it seem right?
Yeah.
Right? And then you're off down the rabbit hole, like you say. And by the way, he's got more rabbit holes than Swiss cheese. I mean, but that's why it's such a delight to read and think about. If you're interested in thinking about things at all, there's nobody better, period.
Now, you say there's two ways to acquire virtue. I think you say one of them is from our parents.
Yes, and that's mostly teaching behavior.
Yeah.
Another way is read Plato's dialogues, read Aristotle's ethics, and just there are people who have thought about morality for 2,500 years and before. They all have something good to say, or their work wouldn't have lasted, right? Another source that's similar to that is religion.
Interesting.
You know, if you're in any religion I can think of, except primitivism or something like that,
they all teach virtue.
They have reasons, right? One of the reasons is, well, you know, God wants you to do that, and you agree that God is perfect, and so he can't be wrong, so you should do that. That's one sort of argument. There are lots of different kinds of arguments, right?
Yeah.
But every religion has a list of virtues and why you should follow them.
Yeah. I think I like the idea of Aristotle, practicing virtue until you become part of that. Because I think we can study them as much as we want to, but if we're not practicing honesty.
Yeah, and the real trick is, he says, you have to already be practicing the virtues for what I say to make any sense. But again, what he means is, yes, your parents and others, right, will help you with the behavior, because they will praise you when you do the right thing, in no uncertain terms will chastise you for the wrong thing, maybe with penalties attached. And you may get rewards for good behavior. So once that's set in and it looks like you have the habit, then you can have Aristotle explain a reason, and his ethics are brilliant. Socrates and Plato will do that. The Stoics will do that. The religions will do that. Any number of more modern philosophers. We read a lot of philosophers who also wrote about ethics, even though we were concerned with politics for the most part.
Yeah. Let me ask you this question from a selfish perspective. Why should I practice virtue when vice pays better?
Well, that's the question that Plato's asking in the Republic. He's always responding to, remember, Glaucon and Adeimantus, two brothers, who keep saying, well, okay, we understand that are virtues, so how does that become better for me if I follow them? Or am I better off if I seem virtuous but am not? Right? And particularly in Book 2.
Sounds like
right?
Prince de Machiavelli.
Yeah, he's an interesting case too, isn't he?
Yeah. Because I'm thinking we've seen this in our society over and over and over. People cheat, corrupt. In most cases, some of them, they get ahead.
A lot ahead.
And then you have seen people who live virtuous life that might get where they want to get, but it might take them longer than this other person who cutting corners.
Or they never get there at all.
Or they never get there at all.
So that's what Socrates is constantly being asked. Why am I not better being unjust and rich and popular and famous than just and just barely scraping by in life. In the big answer that Socrates and Plato give, it's more complicated, but is, well, no matter what you get in worldly terms, if you're unjust, you've ruined your soul.
Which I agree with that.
Yeah, me too. And he works on explaining what that means and what the consequences for you are. Your soul is the most important thing you have. And if you're perfectly just, even though in material or social sense you're a nobody, you have a good soul, a soul that is well ordered. Mm-hmm. And that is the best possible condition you can be in.
So virtue is the highest level of morality. Did you say that?
Yes.
Socrates is basically asking us to live virtuous life, to at least pursue it, learn what it is, and try to live that life because it's good for our soul.
And therefore good for you, and it'll be the best possible life you can lead. Even though you have to set aside the problems of the social world and the material world and understand that it's your soul that matters, not those things. Now, it'd be nice if you could be filthy rich and famous and maybe. And if you had a well-ordered soul, I mean, you got everything then.
And then in return, that's going to be good for our city, be good for our community, be good for our society.
Absolutely. The better the people are around you, the better society is. Because they're going to possess more of those virtues that are more pleasant to be around.
What's the difference between virtue and laws?
Well, we would like to hope that laws are the spelled out virtues so that they're based on the virtues, and if we follow them, we're being virtuous. Now, the laws have gotten away from us in a sense, because I can't imagine how big the warehouse has to be to hold all of just the federal laws.
Yeah.
Right? There's such a huge number. They involve so many details of our lives, of corporate lives, of intergovernmental rules, maritime law, commercial law.
Is that the sign of the society who don't have virtue?
Well, a famous Roman historian named Tacitus said yes. Society with too many laws is not virtuous anymore, and maybe is not a society. And he kind of knew of what he was talking about.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about even your own household. There's very few rules for your kids because everything else is unwritten rules.
Yeah, I mean, we don't usually have to, as parents, spell it out in great detail. Be home by sundown, hold doors open for people following you, don't steal, don't hit.
Yeah. If the society has so many people that are virtuous, there will be less and less laws.
It should be that way. And the other problem with law, as we've seen it just explode even since I was a little kid, is the law can be captured by elements in a society that are going to produce the laws just to benefit a smallish number of people. It's called corporate capture in some areas, but there's other ways that it happens. But typically, for example, if I want to write a law about regulating pharmaceutical companies, right, which is a hot item these days, well, it's really, pharmaceutical industry is really complex, hard to understand. So what happens? The lobbyists for the pharmaceutical companies say, Mr. Congressman, I understand that, this is really complicated. We'll help you out by drafting model law that you can submit to Congress. And oddly enough, there are lots of benefits for the pharmaceutical company in there. And, by the way, here's $300,000 for your campaign this fall.
Now, besides being good for my own soul, why should we care about virtue?
There's no besides caring for your soul. there's no other thing to care much about. If
That
your
is my
soul
soul.
isn't right,
Nothing else is good.
we're all selfish in a way, maybe in lots of ways. But the one most important selfish thing should be to guard your soul and perfect it.
Yeah.
That will make you the best possible person you can be. It can be a real struggle.
Can you see contradiction between laws and virtue?
Sure, all the time. Easy.
That the laws that are being made contradict the virtue?
Sure.
What is our responsibility as citizens, especially the virtuous citizens?
Well, theoretically, the virtuous citizens will vote to overthrow all those laws or vote for somebody who will do that. That pathway doesn't seem to work so well anymore because there's a lot of money floating around. And, I understand they've got to be incredibly tempted. So a scheme that's going around now and supposedly had been made illegal, I thought, is, Congress people and our Congress have these hearings about making certain laws. And so they'll be in committee meetings where they'll be talking of regulations or whatnot. And it will give them information that they can run out and play the stock market and have a sure thing.
Inside trading.
Insider trading.
Is knowledge a virtue?
Oh, boy. Knowledge isn't usually classified among the virtues, but if you don't have knowledge of the virtues, you've got a problem. That's what Plato and Socrates are wrestling with all the time.
Yeah. Let me read this quick for you. Protagoras was telling Socrates, "You, Socrates, are discontent. And why? Because all men are teachers of virtue, each one according to his ability. And you say, where are the teachers? You might as well ask, who teaches Greek? For of that too, there will not be any teachers found." So it looks like Protagoras was still pushing his idea that virtues can be taught.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not an unreasonable question. We learn how to speak the language, and we don't have to have a special teacher.
But that will go back to your thing about how do virtues be acquired, and you say the first place is parents.
But that's not the last place.
Yep.
And Protagoras is suggesting it's like language, where once you've learned to speak by 8, 9, 10 years old, you're there.
Yeah.
Right.
But where do you learn that from? The first place you hear that is at home.
Exactly. However, you're done with the language at a fairly young age, right? Now, we get new vocabulary and all that stuff. But Socrates' point is, yes, you'll be taught how to behave, but you're not being taught about virtue. Incidentally, you're behaving the right way, but there's a lot more to learn. It's a lot harder to learn than you think, and so it can't be taught.
Yeah. Because I'm thinking if you're born in a household and grow up in a household that do not practice virtues at all.
And that happens, sadly.
Yeah. Well, that's all I have for Protagoras, Professor. Thank you for your time.
My time is your time.
Don't say that. We might be doing every week.
Well, every other week anyway.
Thank you, Professor.
Good job.
Yep.
Good job. Thank you.